Regulatory Commission, better known as FERC. By the way, it's a real honor to have the chairman of FERC here with us today. We're very glad to have Norman here in Montana. We've got Bob Rowe, President and CEO of NorthWestern Energy. It's a face you've seen before. Steve Secrist, Senior Vice President, General Counsel, Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer of Puget Sound Energy. And Dennis Vermillion from Avista Utilities, some of you have already seen. And I'm going to turn this over to Travis Kavulla. Please welcome this yet another very distinguished panel here to the stage. Thanks, Travis.
Well, thanks very much. Just a couple of housekeeping things. Like we did with the panel yesterday, if you want to ask a question, the Twitter feed is wide open, hashtag MTEnergy16. And once again, if you're not on Twitter, great way to annoy your children. You can find out all the bizarre things they think until they finally block and unfollow you. Great access point to their lives. I'll just ask my panelists, even though it's tempting to turn and face me when you're responding to a question, instead just swallow your mic. That'll improve the sound quality. And I look forward to having everyone here. These gentlemen's biographies are in your agenda packet, so I won't go through them. But let me start by asking Norman Bay a question. And thank you, Norman, for being here. I understand you had some flight difficulties, not an uncommon experience in getting to Montana, and we're delighted that you made it here to rainy Billings for this panel. And I guess I'll just start with a pretty high-level question to you. Every year, FERC produces a State of the Markets report, and the one for the year 2015 just came out. What are the main takeaways in terms of changes in resource mix for the United States this year?
So one of the main takeaways relates to the shale revolution, and that is the development of an abundant, low-priced gas supply, and that is really driving a lot of change in the resource mix in the United States. In 2015, in 7 of the 12 months for the year, more electricity was produced from gas than from coal. And that's really a first. I mean, the first month it happened was in April of 2015. That was the first time it had happened since the Energy Information Administration had been keeping that data, had been tracking that data. So that's really significant. By the end of the year, in fact, about 32% of the electricity in the United States was produced from gas, 34% from coal. So there was near parity between gas and coal, which is really a fairly remarkable shift. A number of analysts are thinking that with the low price of gas, that the tipping point may occur in 2016 when more electricity is produced from gas than from coal. Another, I think, noteworthy development is the increased use of renewables to generate electricity in the United States. So I would say those are two of the main takeaways, Travis.
Great, and I noticed that this is a trend throughout the world, really, the addition of renewables to the system. How much of that, in your view, is dependent in the United States on production tax credit and investment tax credit subsidies, as well as state renewable portfolio standards? Are we going to see renewable growth even when those things elapse?
So I think that what's happening here is that there has been a fairly dramatic decrease in the cost of renewables. And so that's something that Rob alluded to in his talk over the lunch hour. So that's happened with wind, it's happening with solar, and those price decreases are continuing. So that is one factor. Another factor is state public policy. 29 states and 2 territories have renewable portfolio standards. Another 8 states have renewable portfolio goals. And that, too, is driving the increased use of renewables. And finally, of course, there are the federal incentives that Congress has put in place. And I'm sure that that is also helping to develop renewables.
So one of FERC's main obligations, for those people who don't know, is making sure that the wholesale markets for electricity are efficient, that they run according to principles of least cost dispatch, and of course that the system is reliable as well. And I guess people have raised a question about how markets are compatible with all of these out-of-market interventions by state and federal policymakers. And one of the people who's one of the known wits in the industry, Sue Kelly of the American Public Power Association, often jokes, "Don't talk to me about markets when you've handed out 8 different subsidies before the market is even made." So as the person responsible for making sure these markets are efficiently run, how do you respond to that kind of intervention which can warp those markets?
Yeah, so it's a very interesting question that you raised, Travis. Certainly others have raised it as well. And I think it actually puts FERC in a very difficult position in the sense that, according to the Energy Information Administration, just about every resource receives some sort of subsidy. And so it's hard to know what FERC should do when so many resources receive a subsidy. Would you look at the subsidy that a resource received in a given year? Would you look at it on some sort of rolling historical basis? I mean, what would you do? And there's another very difficult issue, I think, for FERC in that Congress puts these subsidies in place because it is trying to incent the development of these resources. And so FERC is, I think the phrase that's commonly used is a creature of statute. That we rely upon Congress to give us the authority to act, so that we don't, we view ourselves as implementing a congressional intent and congressional policy, not in some way trying to mitigate it or to check it. And so I'm not sure that FERC has the authority basically to sit in judgment of the policy decisions that Congress has made and in some manner to negate them. Under the Constitution, after all, it's Congress as a legislative branch that develops policy. And so I think basically we have to take those subsidies, the support that Congress has put in place as a given, but then from that point onward, make sure that the markets are operating in as efficient a manner as possible.
So you responded talking about congressional actions to subsidize technologies. There's a lot of state activities on the offing too, and to be fair, it is both for renewables and for traditional resources. The big news of today in the energy world is that the PUC of Ohio approved an intervention to essentially bail out a couple of coal plants there that would otherwise close. I know you can't talk specifically about that issue, but maybe you could just address how you, as FERC chairman, think about when to step in and use federal authority to countermand what a state is trying to do with an out-of-market intervention.
So at NERUC, Travis and I were on a panel together, and he asked a similar question. And I have to say, it was a difficult question then, it's a difficult question now. You know, and it poses some really interesting questions. From my perspective, I very much believe in the principle of cooperative federalism, which means that, from my perspective, as a federal agency, we should try very hard to work with states. And so that if states are using their sovereignty to put in place a program that they think makes sense for their citizens, that decision is entitled to a certain amount of deference. And trying to figure out when a state may have gone too far such that its action must be preempted under federal law is a very difficult question. It's so difficult, in fact, that the Supreme Court has now heard 3 different cases raising preemption issues under the Natural Gas Act and the Federal Power Act. And I won't get into the specifics of those cases, but the line that the court seems to be drawing examines whether or not the state program was aimed directly at, in some manner, affecting wholesale electricity rates, and whether or not the impact was direct and substantial. So that seems to be the line that's developing in the Supreme Court case law, and it's a line that basically relies upon decisions by different courts of appeals over the years.
Thank you, Norman, and we'll come back to you with a couple questions on specific policies later, but let me turn to Steve Secrist, the General Counsel for Puget Sound Energy. Steve, PSC owns half of Colstrip Units 1 and 2, and those plants' future has been discussed in depth in the state. It's a major topic of concern that's come up throughout the summit, throughout the legislative sessions that our states have held. I guess I can't really understand it quite, because you've got these coal plants whose fuel cost is a little less than $20 a megawatt hour to produce power. That seems to put them in the money for the regional market, but your company has angled in the state of Washington to pass legislation that would essentially put those plants on a fast track toward closure. So I guess I just put the question to you, what are your considerations other than least cost power generation that are affecting how PSC thinks about its generating fleet?
Sure, thank you. So I'll start by saying I don't agree the characterization, the fast track to closure. Instead, what I would frame as the PSC approach as an investor-owned utility is that we do our generation acquisition through a process that is called an Integrated Resource Plan, or an IRP. In that, we tend to look at very long horizons, and it maintains this reliability approach that says steady as she goes. Let's make sure that we're anticipating what the future is, and we're factoring those things in now. What we've done is, in looking at the realities of Rule 111D, what's going on with our own customers, saying let's at least prepare now for a mechanism that is going to provide a funding for whatever happens with Units 1 and 2. So this isn't intended as any kind of an acceleration. It is rather preparing for the eventuality. Puget Sound Energy is one of 6 partners, owners of Colstrip, and a 50% owner on Units 1 and 2, but we are not in the position of the operator of Units 1 and 2. That position is assumed by Talon in Montana and Talon in Allentown.
So I know now that the legislative session in Washington is wrapped up, the focus seems to shift back to the regulator in Washington, the Utilities and Transportation Commission. And you've been ordered to file a rate case in January of next year. I wonder, what can you share with us now about what Puget is planning to propose relative to the expected remaining lifespan of Units 1 and 2 of Colstrip? And also, what kind of dollar figure are you attaching to decommissioning costs, be it remediation or worker retraining or whatever else would have to be spent to bring down those plants?
Sure. A little context on that. As a result of Puget Sound Energy's last general rate case, we were obligated to actually file a general rate case tomorrow, literally, no later than tomorrow. We were approached by the Utilities and Transportation Commission and asked to consider a deferral of that general rate case. And candidly, this was in no small part just the realities of everything that was going on with the WTC over the course of the next several months. So our position was, if that is the approach, then we would be amenable to complying, even though we literally have the case just about boxed up and ready to go. With that, then, we were also approached well, if we're going to push this out for a series of 7, 8 months, whatever it works out to, and if the Colstrip legislation in Washington State is enacted as law that provides a funding mechanism, then what we would like to propose from PSC is, given that information, as well as the WTC investigation on our ownership of units 1 and 2 and their position, their evaluation of the continuing significant investments in units 1 and 2. Let's take those two pieces, marry them together in the next general rate case, and philosophically bring us everything you know at that point in time so that we can have a robust and transparent discussion. And I agree, Travis, it really does turn it then to the Commission and say, given everything we know, let's have that conversation there in a public forum and then evaluate what is ultimately in the best interest of the customers of the state of Washington, and also use some of the generation acquisition information that is available from our IRP to consider what is also going to be the lowest cost consideration for our customers. But I believe that you're increasingly seeing the Utilities and Transportation Commission in Washington looking at lowest cost as not purely an economic number, but rather a number of circumstances. So we're trying to weigh that and say, okay, we'll bring everything we know. Let's have that conversation. Then, and I believe the second part of your question dealt with the actual cost.
Yeah, so I mean, in a general rate case, for those who don't know, a utility proposes to establish depreciation rates and that include decommissioning expenses that are projected for their facilities, and they build those into rates that are then charged to consumers. So the second part of my question was, what are you anticipating to have to spend whenever Colstrip 1 and 2 is going to be shut down in terms of remediating, worker retraining, all of the things that would need to happen to create an orderly transition?
And one of the things that we will be doing over the course of the next 7-8 months in order to comply with the expectations in the next general rate case is looking at that very question. What are those costs? And what we want to be able to do is at least express in a range what is anticipated just in a vacuum for the costs of undertaking the appropriate levels of decommissioning and remediation, recognizing that we'll be working with our partner, at least as it relates to units 1 and 2, whenever that time comes, to determine what are the appropriate decommissioning and remediation steps. That is a conversation that we will not only have to evaluate over the next 7-8 months, but it's a conversation that we'll have to take up with our partner to make sure that we're in alignment on what is required under the law, what is appropriate under circumstances, and factoring into that the very thing that you raised regarding workers and what we can do, what is appropriate for them.
Steve, one final question for
Sure.
you. So, would this be a proceeding where it might make sense for the state of Montana to intervene as a participant to kind of have its say about what kind of costs are likely necessary?
Emphatically, yes. I mean, our approach is one of, as an investor-owned utility, we're trying to encourage the discussion. We welcome the discussion and recognizing on a topic like this, there are different perspectives and there are very strong positions that have been expressed. That was part of our motivation, quite honestly, in even looking at the legislation. We were saying, with our IRP, given what is happening with climate change, with Rule 111D, with regional haze, I don't think it's any secret we have a trial scheduled for May 31st with the Sierra Club concerning Colstrip, and wanting to put out there for discussion what is the right thing to do. Let's keep managing this forward and ultimately do something that is going to be in the best interest of our customers and minimize costs wherever we can.
Let me move to Dennis Vermillion with Avista. I know you have expressed a kind of middle-of-the-road perspective on the future of Colstrip, and you don't have an ownership stake in the older units, but in the newer units. And I wonder if you could just share your take on this facility with us, Dennis.
Sure. Thank you, Commissioner. Yes, we just as a recap, we do not have any ownership position in units 1 and 2. And as I mentioned yesterday, we have a 15% ownership share in units 3 and 4. And those units have long been a very low cost and reliable resource serving our customers. In fact, it's the second lowest resource in our resource stack behind only our hydro. You know, we've been actively engaged in the regional discussion with all the parties as well for a long time, and we'll continue to do that going forward. But we do look at 3 and 4 through a similar process or the same process actually that Steve mentioned and PSC has, and that's the integrated resource planning process that we go through every 2 years. And the planning horizon is a 20-year horizon. We recently filed, our plan was accepted in Idaho and Washington not too long ago. And with the recent plan and looking out over 20 years, units 3 and 4 continue to be economic resources for our customers. And, you know, certainly, you know, we take that very seriously, providing low-cost, reliable energy to our customers. All utilities certainly do, and cost is a big issue. And the way things sit right now, we believe that that is the best resource for our customers going forward. Certainly there are headwinds. You know, Steve mentioned some of those. There's a lot of activity, around Clean Power Plan and regional haze and ash issues and all that. But we will continue to engage in those and try to work through those issues in a collaborative effort to try to maintain the economic viability of that resource because we believe it's a good one for our customers.
Bob Rowe, NorthWestern Energy bought its share of Colstrip Unit 4 later than the other co-owners acquired it, and so your company has more capital investment tied up in that plant relative to the other co-owners. And for NorthWestern, the depreciation lifespan runs into the 2040s. And you see state legislative activity and other utilities now saying, well, we're going to truncate that lifespan somewhere into the 2030s, if not even earlier. So share with me, are you concerned about having stranded costs tied up in this facility? And what do you view as the future of your ownership in Colstrip?
Sure. Before I answer the question, if I could, just a couple of side comments.
Sure.
One, you've been inciting the crowd to irritate their children for the last several days. And I think perhaps the best way to do that would be to tweet about your children, especially if they're teenagers. So that may be the killer app. And then secondly, Chairman Bay, this is your second trip to Montana in actually just a few months. And as you said, it ain't easy. We appreciate it very, very much. I know you'd wanted to get up to see Mystic Dam, and we would have had to put on climbing skins to get up there, which would be great, but I do hope you come back and see a little bit more of this wonderful state. To answer your question directly, are we concerned about a premature closure? I would say if policymakers get it right, no. And I think there are opportunities to get it right. The sign of a good CEO is hire a lot of people who are way smarter than you are, and you've heard 3 of them in Kurt and Mike, and then John, our supply VP, yesterday, and I think John did a very good job describing that. What Commissioner Kavulla is talking about is the fact that regulated utility assets are depreciated over time. As they're depreciated, that benefit through reduced costs essentially goes to customers. Our interest at Colstrip 4 came into rate base in 2008. It had previously been an unregulated asset, and in fact, as NorthWestern was focusing on becoming a pure utility, it had been sold. It is a valuable asset. It is scheduled to depreciate, as Commissioner Kavulla said, through 2042. The advantage of a slower depreciation is costs are spread out over time, so relatively more of the benefit is experienced up front rather than depreciating more quickly where you're paying it off more quickly. The Commission actually had us do something similar with the hydro system. So the asset depreciates out through 2042. Commissioner, when you get back to your office, I know you're looking forward to seeing our most recent Montana electric supply plan. It will be landing on your desk with a thud. And we do, very much as Dennis said, see that asset as being valuable to our customers out through its life. But again, yes, there is risk from policy decisions in any jurisdiction. We try to focus most on those decisions that are most impactful, so certainly those are going to be decisions in Montana. One word about some of the clean coal ideas that have been floated at the conference. Those are interesting. Those are very exciting. And Commissioner Bushman yesterday had the idea of possibly getting some parties together, setting a reasonable target, and trying to work towards that. That would require certainly the involvement of all of the coal strip owners. And just to kind of give you a rank order for ownership at all 4 units, Puget is an incredibly important partner there in terms of the size of its ownership, followed by Talon. Talon is the operator, followed actually by Portland General Electric, and then Avista and we each own the same 222 megawatts. Theirs is divided between 3 and 4. Ours is at 4. And then finally, Pacific Corp, which of course is part of the Berkshire Hathaway family of fine utilities. We certainly would participate in those kinds of discussions. It's not an easy lift. Retrofitting is expensive. It can be difficult to do. But we are certainly having meetings that we've heard about several technologies here. I've got a meeting set up next week with a young engineer who has an idea about possibly incorporating wind at Colstrip. So it's blue sky, but it's not pie in the sky. And we're certainly willing to weigh in with the other owners.
So Bob, from where you stand now, though, in how NorthWestern is planning, and your plan goes out 2 decades, you don't see a threat to the newer coal strip units?
We believe that certainly 3 and 4 ought to be economically viable out through the 2040s. And we talked about this yesterday at some length. They provide attributes that other resources don't, and they complement other resources, I think, very nicely.
So one final question about Colstrip, and I'm sorry to dwell on the issue, but I see so many people from the community here, and I'll pose this again to you, Bob. NorthWestern, when it was investigating the purchase of the hydros, had the option to buy Talon's entire portfolio or just the hydro assets, and you decided to leave coal on the table, which has left Talon in this position where they have these coal assets. They're pretty clear that they've got a cash tax liability this year. They're looking for a write-off, we read, and the name of that write-off might be their older coal strip units. So I guess, do you see at the moment any possibility for a deal to be done where NorthWestern or another utility takes those units and has some kind of arrangement to sell that production either in a regulated manner or in an unregulated manner to the wholesale customers, like the refineries that depend on it?
Sure. And you're making a good point. And again, when I put up the profile of who uses our transmission system, the activity in our balancing authority, we have responsibility for serving our retail customers, but Commissioner, as you said, there's about 350 megawatts of industrial load on the market, and one of our concerns, and I know it's a concern in this community, has been continued reliable, affordable power for those industrial customers, and they have the ability to purchase power from anyone and from any potential source, wind, solar, coal, whatever, but they're looking for reliability and affordability. We, in fact, the reason that in 2008, NorthWestern was in the process of selling the unregulated asset at Colstrip 4 was we want to focus on being the best retail utility provider to our customers. We would have great discomfort being a merchant. It is certainly possible, and again, there are strategies that the state could pursue if the industrial customers, if the customers who currently take power on the market were interested in supporting it, if the legislature were interested in supporting it, if the commission were interested in supporting it, there are strategies that would allow a party, it could be us, could be someone else, to step into the role that Talon now plays. But it is very inconsistent with the risk profile that we think we should have as a utility and that we think our customers want us to have. So there are lots of pieces that would have to be addressed.
Okay. So thanks but no thanks, but we'll keep the door open.
We're trying to talk to as many people as possible to be constructive in helping the whole state work through this.
Let me turn to the Clean Power Plan and ask you a question, Norman, because you're probably feeling left out. So and speaking of being left out, it sort of seemed to me and a lot of observers on the outside that FERC, which is really the federal agency with the most experience over the electricity grid in the United States, was kind of left on the sidelines for quite some time by the EPA, which is an environmental regulator that's familiar with emissions and technologies at plants. So, but it's, at the end of the day, it's you guys who get blamed and utilities who get blamed if the system is unreliable and inefficient. So why don't you talk to me a little bit about what FERC sees as its role in rationalizing, if one can even use that word, the EPA's regulations on this topic?
Sure. Thanks, Travis. And let me also comment on something that Bob said. This is my second trip to Montana in maybe the last 6 months. And I often tell people that if I weren't a New Mexican, I'd want to be a Montanan. I must say that as beautiful as both states are, Montana beats New Mexico hands down when it comes to fly fishing, which turns out to be one of my hobbies. Yeah.
Okay, enough pandering, Norman.
No, not pandering, the truth. And I also want to thank Senator Daines for inviting me to this conference. I'm honored to be here. Under Section 215 of the Federal Power Act, FERC has the responsibility of overseeing the reliability of the grid. In other words, the transmission system, not distribution, so we don't deal with local outages that a retail customer might experience. It's outages relating to the grid, to transmission. And we take that responsibility very seriously. It's one of our core statutory responsibilities. And so after the Clean Power Plan, the proposed Clean Power Plan was issued, FERC held a series of technical conferences across the United States and invited a number of stakeholders to participate in those conferences: state commissioners, NERC, regional entities, industry, and we really received some very, very helpful comments that helped us think through some of the implications of the Clean Power Plan. At the end of that process, all 5 FERC commissioners signed off on a letter to the EPA in which we made certain recommendations. And I'm pleased to say that the EPA participated in all those technical conferences, and I think they listened closely to what stakeholders were saying as well as what FERC recommended in the letter. And I think that's reflected in the final rule, which did several important things from our perspective. First, it moved the initial target date back from 2020 to 2022. Then it created a reliability review mechanism so that states have to submit their plan for a reliability review by an independent outside party. It could be NERC, it could be a regional entity, it could be an RTO ISO if you're an RTO ISO region. The final rule also recognized a safety valve, which many stakeholders thought was very, very important. And then the rule also allowed for a lot of flexibility in terms of how states could achieve a compliance, including allowing states to use renewable energy credits. What FERC has done after the final rule was issued is to enter into an agreement with DOE, and EPA so that our staff are meeting on a quarterly basis to review potential reliability issues that could arise from implementation of the Clean Power Plan. In addition, we recently issued a staff white paper on modeling under the Clean Power Plan, and that's important for us because we're going to be very engaged on this issue. And what we want to be able to do is to review some of the models that come out and figure out whether or not there are regional impacts from the different state plans that are being proposed. Something else that we've talked about is that if necessary, we would certainly be willing to do additional technical conferences as the plan develops.
So,
of course, at present, there's a stay that's been issued by the Supreme Court.
So if the plan ends up going into effect and the judicial review process is fruitless from the perspective of those challenging the rule, it'll fall back, as we talked about yesterday, to the governors of every state subject to the rule to craft a state plan. And is it your work then that those plans, once you get them all together, can be analyzed in a seamless fashion by your crew, or who would be doing that work to try to understand how each state, when they submit a plan, actually fits together in a grid which, after all, has things in it like Colstrip, these long lines that knit together states?
I think a lot of parties are going to be involved in the review. FERC will be involved, EPA, DOE, states, obviously with respect to their own plans, but they could comment on the plans of other states if they think there are potential problems. NERC and the regional entities, industry. So I think the range of comments that we get from stakeholders could be very helpful here. But one of the things that we're going to be focusing on at FERC is to make sure that there aren't regional concerns that are raised by the combination of different state plans. I think that's where we can add some of the greatest value.
And what happens if FERC identifies a reliability challenge? I mean, so far, and I really like your personality, Norman, but you're a pretty quiet guy, and FERC's a pretty obscure agency compared to the kind of loud and out there EPA. Does FERC have the institutional ability and heft to actually stand up and say, listen, this is a problem, EPA and state A or B?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why we created this working group with the quarterly meetings. And I think that's also why we're very open to the idea of doing tech conferences if they become necessary to address any potential reliability issues. If you're asking me, will FERC take this seriously, I would tell you yes, that we will, that we regard this as one of our core statutory responsibilities.
Travis?
Yeah, absolutely, Steve.
If I may, I'd just like to underscore what Puget Sound Energy believes is the importance of the issue that you've just raised here, because we're not just seeing this at the federal level with EPA effectively dictating matters that could impact reliability, but we're also seeing it at the state level now as well. And in Washington state, there is a proposed clean air rule that could really conflict with the operation of the Clean Power Plan if it was to proceed. And Chairman Bay, I think you're hitting on really an important solution on that and that is the importance of the regional approach to this as opposed to the state-by-state approach. And PSC would certainly join in the chorus of those saying, we believe this needs to be a regional focus worked out with FERC and some of the key stakeholders so that reliability is not ultimately compromised.
Great.
Just to pile on, and
go ahead, Bob.
Made a great point about the differences between the two agencies. To say a little more than that, the EPA is an enforcement agency. The FERC is a quasi-judicial finder of fact. And so I think in that sense, the agency personality is probably what it should be, deliberative, fact-based. But the FERC, and this is Commissioner Kavulla's point, really is the expert agency on the reliability of the overall grid. And this has been a tremendous challenge for state and for state regulatory and state environmental agencies to work together, and then the challenges state to region to federal. And there's really, it's a kind of a political economy problem because there aren't clearly defined lines of authority. As Steve was suggesting, depends tremendously on the ability to figure out ways to cooperate where you can.
Let me turn now to a couple questions on transmission constraints and the difficulty of getting Montana's product to market, which Rob talked on just during lunch, as well as some renewable development issues. And I'll start with Dennis and Steve. I mean, every year a study comes out that suggests that a blend, a regional geographic diversity of renewables is good, and that even with transmission costs, renewables that have high capacity factors in places like Montana are attractive to coastal alternatives. But your companies really seem laser-eyed focus on developing renewables really in only one area near the Columbia River. And you know, Washington State has this renewable portfolio standard that, you know, gives you bonus renewable energy credits if you use union labor, but only in the state of Washington. And there's also difficulties of having to, constraints of transmitting that energy to market. It has to be dynamically transferred without any integration service on the Montana side if you're going to be develop it here. So I guess the simple question that I'd put to Dennis and then to Steve is, do you guys see Montana wind as something that's practical for you to investigate buying, or is the combination of state law and in-state preference just insurmountable from your perspective as Washington and Idaho utilities? Dennis, would you like to go first?
Sure. Well, I don't know that it would be insurmountable. You know, going back to the integrated resource planning process that we go through, when we look at, you know, what might be available to meet our needs, whether they be renewable or not, we tend to look what's closest to our balancing area, our service area, primarily to avoid the transmission and losses, that, you know, the costs that come along with that. So I would say for us, you know, it's more really economics. You know, certainly in Montana, we talked about this yesterday, is a great wind resource with higher capacity factors than what we can find in our service area. But when you add in the costs to get it to our load center compared to the alternative we might have in our backyard, it hasn't penciled out for us yet. And also I might point out, we don't have, you know, we're different than Oregon and California, certainly at this point. We don't have a large need for additional renewable resources, at least for the next 10 years. So that's kind of where we sit. I would also say that the one wind resource that we do have is not in the Columbia River Gorge. It is actually in our service area just south of Spokane.
Apologies for that. How about Steve? Would you like to take a crack at that? Because I know you had just had an integrated resource plan, and it didn't study Montana wind development as a scenario in that plan. So it seems that you've kind of left it out of the discussion entirely. Why is that?
And I wouldn't say we have foreclosed it. I think the way Dennis characterized it is absolutely correct. And if you're going to look at the economics, just honestly right now it does not pencil out. But that's not to signal for one moment that we are predisposed in any one particular location. It comes back to, and if you're not familiar with it, the integrated resource plan does try to look at the various resources that are out there and then marry that combination of low-cost reliability to identify options that are in our best interest. Like Avista, it sounds like we're in the same spot where we're not anticipating anything in the very near future in terms of additional acquisition, but circumstances change, Montana renewables pencil out, then certainly we would want to look at that.
Bob, did you have a comment?
Yeah, your question really is one of the things you could focus this conference around, and that is the The fact, as you've heard, Montana is an extraordinarily resource-rich state, but with finite demand here at home. And again, going back to the diagrams I put up yesterday of our transmission system and balancing area. And one of the risks that a number of speakers have addressed is that we could go from being a net exporter to a net importer, depending on decisions made outside of the state, including at the federal level. But, and this is to Rob's point with the transmission discussion that he teed up, the resources here are attractive, they are valuable. I'll say just a word about the Misty project that, again, that came up in Rob's presentation, Mountain States Transmission Intertie. And this was to respond to requests from primarily wind developers in Montana interested in reaching the coast, the Pacific Northwest, but also the Southwest. And we have a responsibility to respond to interconnection requests. We took that seriously, but also we were excited about doing something that was going to potentially really make an impact on the Montana economy. The project, as you heard, did face some siting challenges, but ultimately, Mike can agree or disagree, I think we would have been able to work through those. What really ultimately caused us to shut the project down, and shareholders took a $24 million write-off, was the absence of market. And what we did, in fact, was systematically, as NorthWestern, not promoting any one project developer over another, but we went around and talked to every load-serving entity, which is regulatory speak for utility, of any size in all of the western United States, Washington, all the way down to California into Arizona, talked to every public utility commission, talked to every state energy office or governor's office. So again, for a variety of reasons, some statutory, some political, some the economics of distance, at that time, it turned out there really was not a market for what, from where we sit, is a great resource. One of the questions is, as the nation's generation fleet does transition, whether that market will be there, whether companies on the coast might at some point have an interest. Final word, there's been reference to integrated resource plans. At least in the Pacific Northwest, the need is for capacity and reserve. That's going to be reflected in our plan, but it's also front and center in the Northwest Power and Conservation Council's 7th regional plan, which has just been released in the last few weeks. So you need resources that are cost effective and that meet the specific need that you've identified.
So, Norman, let me turn the question to you, because each region in the United States seems to do this totally differently in some ways. I mean, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator that MDU is a member of seems to plan for transmission pretty seamlessly across a very wide region, gets big lines built to access wind in the Dakotas and Iowa. Here out west, we're a lot more balkanized. Down in Texas, as you heard, they have a philosophy that that transmission is more like the interstate highway system. You build it, and they will come. That supply will stimulate demand. And I know as a New Mexican, which is kind of a frontier state that has some similarities with Montana, low population but lots of resources that people would like to see access the market. You know, we find ourselves unable to access that market because we don't have enough roadways in the form of big transmission lines. That's something FERC has dealt with for years now. What's the latest, what's your take on what you've just heard and the latest steps that FERC is taking to maybe break what some would say is a market failure?
There really are a lot of similarities between Montana and New Mexico beyond the fact that they're both beautiful states. They're both two of the largest states in the United States. They're fairly sparsely populated, and they're rich in natural resources. New Mexico has got great solar resources. We've got wind, we've got oil and gas, and there's even coal too. So much like Montana, we're an all of the above state, except that we don't have your water. There are some disadvantages to being in a high desert state. But speaking now as a New Mexican who also happens to be the chairman of FERC, it's very frustrating to me to see the lack of transmission development. And FERC has been working very hard for some time now to provide as much regulatory certainty as possible for transmission development, as well as to offer incentives for that development. So that, for example, 5 years ago, FERC embarked upon an initiative known as Order 1000, which required regional and interregional transmission planning and cost allocation. And I know, Travis, that you're on the Northern Tier Transmission Group yourself, but the idea there was to get each region in the country thinking about what regional and interregional lines it needed and how those costs would be allocated. We're going to follow up on Order 1000. We're going to do a technical conference in June. Hope to hear from a range of stakeholders to get their feedback on how Order 1000 is working out in their planning region. Something else that we've done is to try to streamline the interconnection queue process, because obviously even if you build a transmission, you need to make sure that resources can interconnect to that line. And we're going to do a tech conference on that issue as well in a few months, because we really want to take a look at that to see whether or not any improvements are necessary. Something else that we've done is to implement a new two-step discounted cash flow model for calculating base return on equity for transmission. In other words, you build this big line, what's your return on equity going to be? So that's very important. So far, after we've implemented this two-step DCF process, the ROE, the base ROE, seems to be between 9.5% to a little bit over 10%. A number of settlements have come in that range, but I think that is an attractive rate of return. FERC has also offered a number of incentives that a transmission developer can receive, from allowance for funds used during construction, which can go to rate base, abandoned plant cost recovery if you end up having to abandon the plant for reasons beyond your control, getting an adder if you belong to an RTO ISO. There are just a number of things that we've done to try to give incentives on top of the base ROE. We also have a policy statement on the development of merchant transmission lines. These are lines where the developer is bearing the risk of the cost of the project. And a lot of the really long lines in the United States that have been built in recent years are merchant projects. Under FERC's policy statement, the merchant developer, if the developer has an open solicitation process and a process that is not unduly prejudicial or preferential, can basically enter into negotiated rates with potential customers for 100% of the capacity of the line. So that provides some very useful regulatory certainty to developers. So we're doing all these things. But I hear time and again from transmission developers that there are recurring siting issues. FERC does not have siting authority over transmission lines, and that these lines are very expensive. And so if you know you have to make this big investment, but it's not clear you can get the siting authority, and you know it's going to take you many years to develop it, that makes it much harder to develop that project. So clearly, even though we're trying to do everything we can using the authority we have, a lot of very helpful transmission may not be getting built, and that is frustrating, as you've noted, Travis.
So, if I can summarize then, because there was a lot there, require an interregional plan for transmission, make sure the plan has some teeth, sweeten the kitty on the return to make this a good bet for investors who will have to wait forever to see that line constructed and energy flowing on that line and revenues being obtained. Pretty much it?
That's correct. So we're trying to do what we can to provide regulatory certainty and a good, a just and reasonable return on equity.
This is probably the question that Bob is leaning in to ask. So let me see if it is, Bob, because I see you chomping at the bit over there.
Not at all.
But do you think, Norman, first, you know, it sometimes seems that it takes FERC, and to be fair, every federal agency, years to get things done. And I want to ask how you'd respond to that. It's really not a question. It's a fact, at least in some ways. There's, I know, motions for rehearing that penned sometimes for years on the desk of FERC commissioners. And do you think, moreover, that there's a disconnect between the policymakers upstairs and the staff and the administrative law judges who process dockets in the day-to-day?
You know, I actually would disagree with that characterization that FERC is somehow dragging its feet on different kinds of items. And so I guess I would want to know what specific items you have in mind before responding to it. Under the Federal Power Act, if a filing relates to the rates, terms, or conditions of service that a utility has, FERC has to act within 90 days. That's a statutory item. And we crank out those orders pretty quickly. I mean, we very much mind that statutory clock. In fact, last year we issued just the commission itself, as opposed to orders issued under delegated authority by certain office directors, we issued almost 1,400 orders. So I guess I would want to know, you know, the specifics about that particular allegation.
And I don't know that we can talk about the specifics because those cases are still pending before you. And if there's one rule, ladies and gentlemen, about talking to regulators, is that you can't talk specifics of cases. But let me ask you this, though, because it came up the other day. One of the speakers, Norman, was talking about infrastructure getting built. In particular, this was a piece of gas infrastructure. And FERC goes through a process to determine whether something is in the public interest, whether it's really necessary. And the counterpoint had been, well, why should it be a government agency determining whether or not a piece of infrastructure is necessary if you have a set of capital investors who are willing to risk their capital on a speculative move that may or may not make the money? If it proves not to be necessary, it's on them.
So the statute, and maybe this reflects my background as a lawyer, the statute says that the certificate can only be issued if the project is in the public interest. And there has to be a finding of public necessity and convenience, not private interest, not private necessity and convenience. The other thing is when FERC grants a certificate, it's important to understand that the company that receives that certificate has the ability to exercise the power of eminent domain to build that pipeline or that infrastructure. And so I think it would be helpful in that situation to have a regulatory agency doing that assessment as opposed to the company. And in addition, under the National Environmental Policy Act, FERC is required to do an assessment of any potential environmental concerns implicated by the project. Just one other note, so that might be one concern that someone has raised. Last year, FERC certificated 25 gas pipeline projects with a combined capacity of 14.5 billion cubic feet. It was the second most capacity that we have certificated since 2007, over the last decade. We also certificated LNG facilities, Sabine Pass Trains 5 and 6, Lake Charles with a liquefaction capacity of several BCF. And the first LNG shipment left from Sabine Pass to Brazil just a few weeks ago. Historical, first time since LNG went from the lower 48 to another country. And the final stat I'll give you, since you've raised the question, Travis, is that more than 90% of our pipeline certificates are issued within a year of the application being filed with us. So I would actually stack up FERC's record in terms of the timeliness and the thoroughness and the balanced way in which we do it against that of any other agency.
We're going to have to leave it there, which means I can't ask Bob Rowe about net metering, but there'll be an opportunity for you to answer those questions, Bob Rowe, at an event coming soon to the Montana Public Service Commission, no doubt, now that you've filed your resource plan. So come one, come all to see that. Let's thank our panelists for being with us today.